Okay, well, thanks everyone, and welcome to the next module. So within this module, we'll get into just the different pricing models that are available to, whether you're an online merchant, retail-based merchant, a business-to-business merchant, really the pricing models are applicable to really every type of business model that's out there. But we'll dig into the specifics of online sellers, particularly within the US, and then we'll talk about some of the fees that happen when you're selling internationally. The most common model that we now see in terms of just pricing that's out there and everyone's probably familiar with in working with Stripe or again, Shopify Payments, or just really any mainstream provider that you can set up with, whether it's Airwallex or even Revolut, is fixed pricing, or it's also known as blended pricing. So in this case, what the provider does, they make things very simple for their merchants, is that they'll charge a percentage, which in the case of Stripe in the US, it's 2.9%. And then a transaction fee of 30 cents per transaction. So, again, thinking back to when I started in payments and particularly with international payments, is that, Stripe really made things easy for merchants to understand because it's a flat rate no matter what the card type is. And so that really makes it very easy to understand what you're paying, for X amount of transactions run through or whatever the volume percentage would be. So if you're at 100,000 in volume, you can expect roughly about $3,000 in charges to be charged to you at the end of that month. So in looking at it, again, this keeps things very simple, and it's a very popular model for most online sellers, especially as you're starting out. And so even as you start to grow and scale and move to more advanced economics within the business, there have been some cases where people do prefer just a flat rate model, even if it's more expensive than, let's say, our Interchange Plus model, which we'll get into next. Again, transparency is really the key here. It's very easy to understand. There's not really much second guessing in terms of what you're paying when you're accepting those transactions online. The next one is called Interchange Pricing, or it's also known as Interchange Plus. In some cases, it's called Interchange Plus Plus. I like to just think of it as wholesale pricing. So behind the scenes, when a card is accepted or whenever you're issued a card as a consumer, is that there's a cost to support the infrastructure of that card. So when you're using, let's say, the likes of a debit card, or you have funds that are tied to an account, like a prepaid card, there's really not a lot of infrastructure per se to support that card. You're not really getting any points. There's not a lot of reporting mechanics. It is just a plain manila card that is linked to, let's say, your debit or your checking account. So those cards are actually less to clear in some cases versus, like, let's say, a rewards card. So in the case of interchange, you may be paying less than 1%, or that acceptor may be paying only less than 1% on interchange for that card to be accepted. So as you can see in the case of Stripe, if you're accepting a lot of debit cards, or let's say you have a lower average order value on your business, you're paying a pretty significant markup if the cost to clear the debit card is less than 1%, which it is if you're accepting a card from a regulated bank such as a Wells Fargo, a JP Morgan, Bank of America, whoever it would be in the US. Now, as you start to change the card type and let's say your average order value goes up, a lot of times those cards that are being paid for the merchandise are going to be, let's say, a rewards card, or maybe it's American Express card, or a card that just has some type of point system or mechanism to support that infrastructure. In those cases, the interchange cost could be more than 1%, or it could be upwards of 2%. And in the case of, let's say, American Express, it could be high 2s, low 3s. And that is just the wholesale cost to accept that card. So every merchant has to pay the fees to accept, whether it's Visa, whether it's MasterCard, American Express. There's always going to be a hard cost, and that hard cost is then passed on to the providers, right? So the providers are then passing it to the merchants. And so the only thing is that with Interchange Plus is that you're being charged whatever the cost of that card is to clear, and then there's a plus or a markup. And so in the case of Plus, they can charge, let's say, basis points. Maybe it could be 1%, or maybe it's 2%, or they're charging an additional transaction fee for that transaction. So in a lot of cases, let's say if the card that is being paid online is 1.5% on the interchange fee, and the provider is charging you a markup of 2%. Well, doing the calculations, well, now you're paying 3.5%, right? But in the case of a debit card, let's say it's 80 basis points or less than 1%, and they add the, let's say 2%, or it could be even 1%, well, that's less than Stripe in that case, right? So that's for more sophisticated merchants, in my opinion. As you start to scale up, as you start to grow your business, interchange pricing is something that you definitely want to look at because you can save significant margin. And as you start to scale, and I would say as you approach 500,000 plus a month or $1 million, you can start to have some pretty serious discussions about bringing down your fixed rate, or even if you're on interchange pricing, you can start to negotiate. So there's a few things involved with that negotiation. And when you're looking at a wholesale pricing structure, is they want to look at what you're selling. So if you're selling a low risk item that maybe it's electronic or a hard good that doesn't have a lot of returns, or you're not having a lot of issues with chargeback shipping, that is something that could qualify you for a lower discount on the Interchange Plus, right? And so that can also happen on fixed pricing. You can negotiate based on your industry risk. In addition, the volume levels, as I mentioned before, the more volume you do, so if you're looking at it from, like a corporate standpoint, the likes of Walmart or these big corporations, they get massive discounts on their interchange or on their fees because they're doing so much volume. Things like utility companies and any type of like nonprofit government agencies, they're able to get discounted pricing, not just on the markup, but also on their interchange or their wholesale cost. So there's a lot that goes into it, but this just gives you a perspective in terms of the difference between like what the fixed rate pricing would be, which is kind of one size fits all, versus interchange is going to change based on the card that is being used to pay. So again, it can go up or down, it varies, and you have to keep an eye on the calculations. And again, as your average order value goes up, typically that is a higher level card being used, whether it's a points card, rewards card, Sapphire card, Amex. You're going to pay more for that card type, but again, you're getting whatever that wholesale rate is and a markup. The other two options, again, that are not as popular, I would say, in e-commerce, but are common in the retail space, or if you're selling not only online, but in person, is subscription. So the payment processor will charge you a flat fee based on your volume, and that can change as you start to process more. So let's say, for example, you're processing between $0 to, let's say, $50,000 per month. There may be a $300 a month subscription fee, and then there's cost on top of that, whether that is a transaction cost or a flat cost based on the volume, or percentage based on the volume. And that can move up or down based on the volume levels that you're actually doing. So as you do more volume, the subscription amount goes up, but it's possible that the transaction fee goes down, or the percentage on top of that goes down as well. So that's a common one that we've seen. There was a company called Fat Merchant that is now relabeled Stacks that is what was really, they cut their teeth on subscription. They charge a flat fee, and then they just had the markup based on whatever the transaction fee would be. Last but not least is tiered pricing. So tiered pricing, again, a little bit more old school, I would say, more popular, I would say, in more of a retail setting. So there's 3 different tiers. And so if you look at it, there's a qualified tier, which basically would mean if I'm walking into a store, for example, I pay with my debit card, that qualified rate may be 1.2%, which is obviously significantly lower than, let's say, the likes of Stripe at 2.9%, but it's a low risk transaction, right? And I'm paying with a debit card, which technically could be less than 1% as a wholesale cost, but they're charging, let's say, 1.2 or 1.4%. So there is some margin there, right? So they are getting that margin, the payment processor, based on the transaction being qualified. Now, in the case of a mid-qualified transaction, that may be a rewards card or a card that is a higher level card, a higher infrastructure card to support. That mid-qualified rate may be 2.3%, right? And the cost for clearing a rewards card is, let's say, 1.6 or 1.8%. So as you can see, there's margin there to the processor. So the processor is collecting that margin, but they're just putting it into a bucket or a mid-qualified rate where they're getting that constant margin every time. Now, a non-qualified transaction may be one where, let's say if some of the data is missing, or it's a very high-end card, it's a corporate card, or it's a higher end card like a Sapphire card. It's something that's typically out of the norm from what, let's say, the likes of what you typically accept are. Or if there's just data missing from the transaction, they'll put it into what's called a non-qualified transaction rate, which in this case could be 3%. I've seen it upwards of 4%, in some cases 5%. Depends on how the provider structures this, but these are really the most common ones. And so just to kind of recap, the one that you're always going to see out there, which again, everybody seems to like because of transparency, is the fixed or blended pricing, but it comes at a cost. There is going to be a pretty significant markup, but the perk is that you know what you're paying every month, and there's never really going to be a change from that. The discounted one, and what most large volume merchants are on, are what's called interchange pricing, which is basically giving you the pass-through rate and the additional markup on top of that. Again, very popular, and more popular with a lot of bigger volume merchants that are more sophisticated, that understand that, hey, I may not be paying the same every month based on the volume. Let's say if it's 100 grand, it could change, it could swing, but most cases it'll swing down, because if you're looking at the back end margins that is being applied, then you can save some money there. Next is subscription. This is again more geared for retail merchants. I don't see a lot of online sellers with this model, but it is available for merchants that are selling online. This charges a flat fee and then a transaction cost on the back based on the volume. And then you have tiered, which tiered pricing, again, very rare for sellers to have a tiered pricing structure, because in most cases, everything's going to fall either here or it's going to fall here, which you're paying a much higher rate. So anytime you're selling online, the transaction is key entered, that typically will auto default to one of those two higher tier rates. So hopefully that gives you a better perspective on exactly what the payment options are out there. This is really kind of the 4 most popular ones out there. There are some different hybrid options, such as fixed rate with a surcharge, and there's other kind of variants that are out there. But as a seller online, these are the 4 that you're going to see as most common. So hopefully that helps out, and we look forward to seeing you on the next module. Thank you.